There was so much drama in round 3 of the Norway chess tournament that instead of going through one game, I'm going to give you a quick tour of 4 of the games in the round, looking at just a few critical moments in each game. We start with Sergei Karyakin against Simon Agdestein. Karakin threw the kitchen sink at Agdestein. He attacked like crazy, but Agdestein was up for it and found a series of only moves, survived the attack, and we join the game after 52 moves. So Agdestein with black, you can see he has the advantage of rook over bishop. Pawns are equal, and his king, although his king is exposed, well, it's adequately defended by the queen. Now at this moment, Karyakin decided that he would exchange queens in order to take this pawn and try to rush this one down the board. So it's turning into a race. Agdestein also has this passed pawn. So what's going to happen? Let's see how the game panned out. So Agdestein pushed his passed pawn. They're both trying to get to the queening square. Karyakin pushed his rook's pawn, supported by the king. The rook came down. Now, of course, black would love to play this pawn advance, but then white would give up the bishop, and it's impossible to stop white queening. So Agdestein had to take here first and bring the rook round to stop the pawn queening. But now, well, again, it's turning into another race. So the white's second pawn comes into the fray. The king comes up the board, and now white makes a queen. Of course, this is taken. Black has to deal with that pawn, and then white's king comes back. And here the players actually agreed to a draw. Basically, white's king gets back in time, takes that pawn, and, well, we're going to be left with 2 kings on the board, and that is definitely a draw. But Agdestein missed a win. Let's go back to this moment, just at the start of this endgame. Now, instead of pushing this pawn, he could have played king over. Now, what's the difference? Let's take a look. Well, there are a few variations here. Let me show you the critical one. Let's see what would happen if Karyakin played as he did in the game. So, moving the king to the side, allowing the pawn to race down the board. This is an important move. You give a check with the rook. Now, let me show you some of the main lines here. Well, what happens if the king goes up the board, still trying to support this pawn? Well, the black king travels over, and comes over here, and you can see that black has set up a mating net. So the bishop comes here. Now check. The king has to go back to block the pawn, and then the pawn advances, and, well, this is going to be very, very easy to win. The rook will come down, and we'll be able to win this bishop. So black will win very easily there. Okay, back to this position. So what about king here? Now the rook swoops down, and there's a difference between this position and the game continuation. When white pushes, we take this pawn with check. So black gains time. And let's see, king here. Let's take another pawn. The pawn pushes, but the rook comes back. So in this case, well, this is going to be too much for white. The king is going to support these pawns coming forward, and the rook can always sacrifice itself for this pawn, so black will win there. So, well, there are other variations, but that's basically the main story. So very unlucky for Agdestein, missing a win there. Maybe if he'd had more time and more energy at the end of the game, he'd have found it. But still, he's having a pretty good tournament. He's the lowest rated player in the tournament. He's 47 years old, but it shows that, you know, he's still really a force to be reckoned with. 20 years ago, he was Norway's #1 player and a world-class player, but then went off and into other directions. He was a professional footballer, incredibly, and also, of course, a former trainer of Magnus Carlsen. But it's great to see him coming back in this tournament. Okay, what about the other Norwegian in Norway chess? Well, let's have a look at the crunch encounter between Magnus Carlsen and Fabiano Caruana. Caruana leading the tournament at the start of round 3. And Magnus Carlsen said yesterday, it's time to stop him. Fighting talk. We joined the game after 25 moves, and Magnus's opening went very well for a change. You can see he has this fantastic pawn chain, and that really shuts out Black's pieces. Now, what Black would love to do here is play his pawn forward to attack that leading pawn here. Here, Carlsen played g3 with the idea of blowing up Black's king position, actually, with the pawn advance f4. With hindsight, it might have been better to play queen here, preventing Black playing c6, because, of course, the knight would be hanging. And I think with this powerful centralisation, White keeps control. White has an excellent position. But, okay, Carlsen judged that this was the correct way to play. But then came c6, and he must have miscalculated. Of course, c6 is the obvious pawn break. Magnus played pawn to f4. If this pawn is taken, you can see how that liberates Black's pieces. There's going to be play on the c file. But Magnus thought that he must have been doing well after this pawn move. But he must have miscalculated. He took here. Now it's getting very complicated. The pawn advanced to d4. If the knight goes back, the bishop comes in, and this pawn is looking rather vulnerable. Magnus played queen a3. Now at first glance this looked pretty good. If pawn takes knight, of course, the rook is hanging here. There's pressure on the d file. Maybe Magnus underestimated this move. Suddenly there's a threat to play pawn here, attacking queen and knight, very nasty. So Magnus felt he had to give up a piece. Rook can't be taken because of this pin. Still a really complicated situation, but it's clear that things have gone wrong for Magnus. Caruana stepped aside with the rook. Magnus exchanged queens and moved the rook over. So Magnus has 2 pawns against a bishop. So a material advantage for Caruana, and that's still a very messy position. And somehow, well, let's go on with a few more moves. Somehow Magnus managed to keep enough pressure. It seems that around here, Caruana missed a couple of good continuations. They arrived at this endgame. That move was to distract the rook from taking here. They arrived at this endgame where Magnus has 3 pawns against the knight, and he had just about enough pressure to draw the game. It was quite a long game, but Carlsen got there in the end and made a draw. So Magnus didn't exactly stop him today. He didn't stop Caruana. He did slow him, though. So Caruana still leads the tournament with 2.5. Okay, let's move on to another game. Now, this was extraordinary. Alexander Grishuk against Levon Aronian. Now, we joined the game after just 9 moves. Now, you can see that Aronian has brought his queen out at a very early stage. Now, this has been played before, but it's quite double-edged when you bring the queen out at such an early stage. Let's see how the game progressed. d5, attacking the knight. The knight came back. Now, of course, White gains time by driving the knight back, but it does leave a weak square here. Of course, the bishop might sit well on this square. Maybe the knight can come around to this square as well. So white gains time, but maybe loses control over a square. Grishuk made this extraordinary move, h4, trying to hassle black's queen, and maybe he can use the h-pawn to attack later. Knight d7. Now bishop d3 from Grishuk, attacking the queen. Here, maybe it's best to play f5. Maybe queen here, but certainly not this move e4. Now this looks fantastic. The pawn attacks two pieces. But Grishuk had analysed this carefully. He pushed the pawn to h5. Now, Aronian decided he wanted to keep hold of this pawn, but he'd overlooked Grishuk's next move. Rook here, an extraordinary move. If pawn takes bishop, then rook f4 traps the queen. But the problem is that Aronian has few options here, because if he plays knight c5, then white can simply take off this pawn. He's given up a piece, but he wins it back straight away, and after rook takes, well, black's king is in terrible trouble. So here, well, Aronian was asked after the game, did you consider resigning here? He said, no, I didn't consider resigning, but I did consider hitting myself. Basically, he's got a lost position. He decided to give up his queen, but Grishuk played very calmly here. First of all, he drove the bishop back, stepped out of the way with his king. Knight here, excellent move. If this is traded, then pawn takes, and that's a beautiful clump of pawns. Bishop was driven back. So what Grishuk is doing is targeting this knight, which protects this far advanced pawn. He exchanged off the knight and took the pawn. Okay, so that's step one. Grishuk did this very calmly, very carefully, and now next target, he wants to take this pawn. So he simply manoeuvred his queen round. Well, okay, first of all, took care of that pawn. Okay, manoeuvred the queen round very carefully and took this pawn, and then it really was curtains for Aronian. The rest of the game, well, terribly easy for white. So excellent win for Grishuk there, and a shock for Aronian. Terrible loss. Number 2 player in the world, but sometimes he has these kind of disasters. Okay, next game, Anish Giri against Vladimir Kramnik. I'm going to go right to the end of the game. I thought Kramnik played an excellent game. He outplayed Giri, and here you can see he's just put pressure on this pawn here. If with queen and bishop, if this pawn advances, then black is crawling in on these light squares. There's a terrible discovered threat through the queen, and when the queen moves, then rook d1, well, white's king is in a mating net. Giri perhaps could have defended better if he'd taken off this knight, but instead, demoralised, he played rook here, and Kramnik simply took off this pawn, and Giri resigned here. Let's see what happens if, well, obviously if bishop takes, then queen takes his mate. Okay, let's see about this move. Rook takes pawn. There's a forced win for black. And now knight g5, excellent move. If, obviously, rook here, then queen check, and white's king is caught in a mating net, knight f3 to follow. And if rook h4 to prevent the queen check, then queen c6 hits white from another angle, checking the king, and then you take the bishop, and it's curtains. Nice victory for Kramnik. Oh, by the way, in the other game, Svidler and Topalov drew. Not, well, an interesting game, but anyway, it petered out to a draw. So, after 3 rounds, Fabiano Caruana still leads with 2.5. Kramnik and Grishuk on 2. Carlsen, Aronian, Agdestein on 1.5, and the rest on 1. tomorrow is a well-deserved rest day for the players. See you again for round 4. Thanks for watching.